Confident in his impunity, the tourist crossed the forbidden line, spat in the face of the royal guardsman, and laughed, believing his money gave him the right to do anything. The crowd froze, waiting for a reaction, but the guardsman's response left everyone in stunned silence. What began as an ordinary day turned into a lesson the tourist would never forget. Let's uncover how it all unfolded. On Trafalgar Square, where history meets modernity, the usual London hustle and bustle filled the air. Tourists eagerly took photos, fed pigeons, and admired the grandeur of the city. Yet, the main attraction, as always, was Sergeant Graham Hudson of the Royal Guard. His tall bearskin hat, impeccably pressed uniform, and immovable posture made him the embodiment of British discipline and honor. For Graham, this wasn't just another workday. Every step he took, every breath, was a tribute to tradition. His gaze, fixed into the distance, seemed to say, "I am here for my duty, not for your entertainment." However, among the crowd was someone who saw him quite differently, a man wearing a bright t-shirt with the bold print "Born to Rule," which, to be fair, didn't match his sloppy appearance, stood out. On one hand, his look could make anyone laugh. A wide grin, a backpack overloaded with gadgets, clumsy movements. On the other hand, his confidence in his own importance was irritating. "Hey, buddy, why so serious?" he shouted, waving his phone. "Smile, that's what you're here for, right?" His voice was loud, balancing between fake cheerfulness and outright provocation. The crowd chuckled. Some nodded approvingly, others just shook their heads, but no one interfered. Sergeant Hudson, as the rules demanded, remained motionless. But inside, he was simmering. After all, this scene played out every day. People came to admire symbols of tradition, but instead of respecting them, they turned everything into a show. "Oh, really?" the tourist continued, putting his hands on his hips. "Come on, give us something. My camera will love it. Let's say cheese, folks." He took a few steps forward, ignoring the white line that marked the boundary no one was allowed to cross. And that's when what viewers on social media would later call the moment of truth began. The man, feeling entirely untouchable, moved to the next stage of his performance. His voice grew even louder, his gestures even more exaggerated. "Come on, buddy. Show some emotion, or are you a robot?" And with those words, to everyone's shock, he spat at the guard. The air seemed to thicken as if before a storm. The crowd froze. Someone gasped. Someone pulled out their phone to capture the scene. But the most striking thing wasn't the spit itself. It was Graham's reaction. He remained motionless. His face seemed even more stone-like, if that was possible. Only those standing closest could see how his neck muscles tensed and how his hand trembled ever so slightly. And here, you, dear viewer, are probably thinking, how does he tolerate this? I couldn't. Well, there he is, a true hero. Someone who keeps his dignity even when the world around him has completely lost it. The crowd began murmuring in outrage. "That's too much. Who does that? That's just beyond unacceptable. The Royal Guards are a symbol of our country, and he thinks he can treat them like this?" The tourist turned around, seemingly for the first time sensing some discomfort. His support in the crowd was vanishing before his eyes, but instead of retreating, he took another step forward, as if testing the sergeant's limits. Seriously? He thought he could tease a lion? Well, let's see how this ends. The crowd, frozen in disbelief after the tourist's audacious act, began to stir. Whispers of outrage grew louder, filling the square with tension. And then, suddenly, from the sea of people, a small boy stepped forward. He couldn't have been older than 10, but there was a determination in his eyes that could shame many adults. "Hey you," the boy shouted, addressing the tourist. "That's not right. My grandfather was a guardsman, and he wouldn't be proud of you." The boy looked the man straight in the eye. His voice was so loud and confident that the crowd fell silent. The boy's words seemed to strike at the man's ego, but the tourist simply laughed, trying to maintain his bravado. "Oh, come on, kid," he said with a smirk, speaking more to the crowd than to the boy. "It's just a show, a mannequin in a costume. Nobody will remember this in 5 minutes." The crowd stirred uneasily. Voices of disapproval began to ripple through. "That's over the line. How dare he? The Royal Guard is a symbol of our heritage. Show some respect." But the tourist wasn't backing down. His overconfidence was almost palpable, and the growing backlash only seemed to egg him on. Adjusting his t-shirt as if to emphasize his importance, he ignored the crowd's reactions and moved closer to the guardsman. And then, from the crowd, another figure emerged, an elderly veteran leaning on a cane. His chest gleamed with medals, and his upright posture spoke of a man well-versed in discipline and duty. The veteran said nothing as he approached, stepping in front of the tourist and positioning himself as a shield between him and the guardsman. "Young man," the veteran finally spoke, his voice low but resolute. "Once upon a time, men like him stood to protect your freedoms. If it weren't for people like this soldier, you wouldn't be standing here behaving like this. Show some respect." And here, dear viewer, you probably thought, finally, justice. Yes, we felt it too, because when the voice of reason and decency speaks so loudly, even the most brazen have to stop and think. The tourist, visibly flustered, hesitated. His gaze darted between the veteran, the guardsman, and the crowd, which had now clearly taken their side. Someone in the crowd yelled, "Be grateful they didn't throw you out already." What a disgrace. Just apologize. But instead of admitting his mistake, the tourist attempted to save face with yet another stunt. "Well, if you're also bored, I'll give you a show," he said, clearly hoping this gesture would deflect from his embarrassment. He stepped forward again, clearly intending to do something foolish. But in that instant, the guardsman moved. His step forward was swift and commanding, and every motion seemed calculated to the millimeter. The sergeant's voice, cutting through the noise of the square like a clap of thunder, echoed across the crowd. "Stay where you are, sir." The power and authority in his voice seemed to freeze time itself. The tourist stood rooted to the spot, his arrogance dissolving in an instant. The towering figure of Sergeant Graham Hudson loomed over him, radiating an aura of strength and dignity. His icy gaze bore into the man, leaving no doubt as to who was in control. And you, dear viewer, were likely thinking, here it is, the moment of truth. Let's see how this so-called hero gets out of this now. The square fell into a hush. The crowd, stunned by the sudden turn of events, couldn't take their eyes off the scene. The veteran gave a slight nod, as if to say, "This is how it's done." The tourist, meanwhile, stood paralyzed, finally realizing that no joke or stunt could make him the center of attention again. The crowd stood frozen in suspense. It seemed even the wind had stopped, as if afraid to break the silence. The guardsman's words, spoken with icy calm, echoed across the square. "Clean up after yourself, sir." Sergeant Graham Hudson, maintaining his unshakable dignity, pulled out a pristine white handkerchief, carefully wiped his face, and extended it to the tourist. The action, so deliberate and composed, left the tourist visibly stunned. It was clear he had no idea how to respond. "Well, what's the matter, buddy? Thought your arrogance had won? Guess what? This man in uniform just showed you that his composure is stronger than your ego." Murmurs swept through the crowd. "He broke protocol, but that was so impressive." Instead of outrage, admiration filled their voices. People held up their phones, capturing every second. Someone even started clapping, and soon the applause spread like wildfire through the square. The atmosphere had shifted completely from tense to triumphant. The tourist, now pale and visibly shaken, fumbled awkwardly with the handkerchief. Under the quiet chuckles of the crowd, he wiped it on his sleeve before shoving it into his pocket, looking entirely unsure of himself. "That's a royal response," someone in the crowd shouted, and laughter mixed with more applause erupted across the square. But it wasn't over yet. An officer of the police, drawn by the commotion, emerged from the gathering throng. Approaching the tourist with polite but firm authority, the officer spoke in a low voice. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to come with me." A brief exchange followed, barely audible amid the noise of the crowd, but it was enough to send the tourist's last shred of confidence crumbling. With hundreds of eyes watching, he was led away from the square, his former bravado nowhere to be seen. And here, dear viewer, let's pause for a moment to savor that feeling of justice. This is what we all watch stories like this for, isn't it? That moment when arrogance finally gets what it deserves. As the crowd began to settle, the elderly veteran stepped forward once more. Despite his slow movements, his posture remained proud. He approached Sergeant Hudson, placed a hand on his shoulder, and said quietly, "Thank you, son. Today, You reminded people that honor is more than just a word. The guardsman gave a brief nod, adjusted his hat, and resumed his post. His gaze once again fixed forward, as if nothing had happened. Yet, something had changed. The crowd now radiated respect. People who just moments ago had giggled at the situation now took photos from a respectful distance, whispering words of admiration. It's moments like these that remind us why traditions matter. They teach us respect, showing that resilience and honor are values that remain constant, even in a rapidly changing world. Meanwhile, social media was already lighting up with videos of the day's events. Headlines told the story, loud and clear. When a royal guardsman taught a rude tourist a lesson in respect. True royal style, how composure triumphed over arrogance. And indeed, in a world where flashiness often overshadows substance, Graham Hudson had proven that true strength lies in restraint and dignity. And you, dear viewer, surely felt it too, didn't you? That sense of pride in people like him. It's why we watch and retell stories like this,